Good morning, everyone. My name is Lance French. I'm the Business Development Manager for W&M Environmental, a division of Braun Intertech, and I would like to welcome you all to our webinar on endangered species. Our expert today is our W&M's very own Anjali Karve. Thank you for joining us, Anjali.
Thank you.
You can say thank you. Yeah,
thank
you're
you,
allowed
Lance.
to talk now. Thank you. Before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. If you have questions, please send them to me through the chat tab of your GoToWebinar window. If we don't get to your question, I'll make sure that Anjali gets them and we can get an answer to you right away, or as soon as possible, I should say that. We are recording this webinar and it will be available to rewatch on our website soon, probably tomorrow, along with the slides that we're going to show you today. And I will send you an email with the link when they are made available. So let's get to it. So Anjali, so endangered species. So this is kind of a, oh yeah, I need to introduce you, I guess. I'm sorry about that. So
That's all right.
so Anjali Karve, she's our certified ecologist and fish and wildlife biologist.
That's correct.
And you studied in Alaska.
I did my master's in Alaska.
And you're from Canada. You worked in Canada.
Uh-huh.
But you're from?
I'm from India.
Okay.
And I went to graduate school in Alaska, studied fish. Went to graduate school in Canada, University of Toronto, studied mammals, and I worked as a consultant in Canada as well.
And by the way, this is your second webinar.
It is.
So I must have done something right to get you back because
I'm still here.
That's awesome. Thank you for being back with us. Okay, so that's a pretty nice fish on that picture there. So
yeah, it's the lake trout. We were doing some work for a nuclear power plant, so we were on an electrofishing boat, electrocuting fish, shocking fish, shocking them.
So what were you out there doing? Just
some studies they were basically Ontario Power Generation. They were going to put a new reactor, and so we were doing some
making sure that
due diligence studies.
The fish had two eyes and
exactly something like that.
So. So that's a nice one.
Yeah,
so,
Lake Ontario.
So you electrocuted those fish. You didn't just.
We just shocked them.
You didn't use like
they didn't
a big
die.
net.
Yeah, we weighed them, measured them, and put them back.
Man, that's pretty.
We didn't
rough.
take them home to eat.
All right. Well, that's pretty awesome. Have you done that lately?
No.
Okay.
It's been a while.
I want to go with you when you do that.
It's fun.
All right. So, okay. So, where should we get started? So, it's Endangered Species Act. So you want to start there?
Yeah, let's start with the big picture here. So let's start with the Endangered Species Act. That was it was a significant piece of legislation that was passed during the Nixon administration. It basically affords the highest level of protection for threatened and endangered species, imperiled species, and their habitat. And the level of protection for both. They categorize them under the Act as threatened and endangered species, and they're afforded the same level of protection for both categories. And endangered really means a species that is in danger of extinction throughout or all of its significant portion of its range. And threatened is just like one below, means it's a species that is likely to become endangered within the foreseeable future. So
threatened, you're kind of like, you're on deck.
On the way, yeah.
You're on
the way to being endangered.
One day, maybe. No, not just kidding. Maybe one day you could be on that. Okay, gotcha.
That's not the goal, though.
I would hope not. Yeah.
Right. So they're afforded the same level of protection. They're administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services and the National Marine Fisheries Service. Fish and Wildlife usually, has jurisdiction over terrestrial and inland waters. And the fisheries service take care of all marine species.
Okay, so marine species would be anything in the seas, saltwater coming out. Okay.
Yeah, whales, dolphins.
Yeah. Okay, so now
manatees.
What about not that lake trout, but what about the salmon who are out in the sea and then they swim upstream during that?
Yeah. So I think in the case of salmon, it depends on where the project is, but I think they have dual jurisdiction.
Yeah, they don't have like argument. No, this is my jurisdiction.
No, I think they work towards the recovery and protection of a species. So usually they don't fight over a species jurisdiction, but I think it really depends on where the project is. If you have a project out in marine waters and there's salmon there, then it would be the fisheries service. But if you have salmon in freshwater streams, rivers, then it would be the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. But I think they coordinate with each other to come up with a plan.
Okay. And ultimately, who makes the call that a species is going on the list?
They do. So the U.S.
You say they, so
the
both of them
agencies,
together?
Yes. So they have a panel where they make that decision on what species are threatened, what species are endangered, and they also have a candidate list of species. You can have, there's been species that have been on that candidate list for years, like 20 years. So it's an exhaustive, extensive process to actually get a species to be put on the threatened and endangered species list. So they have to go through multiple studies and comments from the public, so on and so forth.
Okay.
Yeah. But they make that decision eventually.
Okay. And so, so this is kind of an emotional subject. Everybody loves polar bears. Everybody loves the baby turtles and the otters and the whales. Is there any whales or whales? Okay.
Yeah,
it's the whales. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but day to day, why is this relevant? I mean, why are we talking about this today?
Right, because it affects everybody. I mean, there's endangered species all over the nation, and some states also have their own lists.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that.
Yeah, so I mean, I've got some fun, pretty photos of state-listed species here. So all federally listed species are technically endangered or threatened within a state, obviously, but it's not vice versa. So all state-listed species are not federally listed. A lot of states have their own lists, threatened, endangered, species of conservation concern, species that they keep a watch out for, and their populations. And these are just some examples of organisms throughout the country that are, states that regulate and have their own endangered species list.
Texas
Parks and Wildlife.
They would be the ones that would put that on there. So so I see plants. So I guess I don't even really realize plants. They're a part of that too.
There are, I think, about 1,000 species. Well, each state has its own list, but on the Endangered Species Act, there are about 1,000 species of plants that are listed, and about 1,500 animals or something like that. And
so I'm assuming because I just usually don't think of plants as being an endangered species, which, you learn something every day. But so obviously insects as well. Insects as well, yes. Every taxon. And plants are interesting and especially vulnerable because a lot of the times plants can be endemic. Basically, they're only found in one place because they like a certain type of soil, or they only grow on like cliff sides or something like that. So if you have a project that's coming through and bulldozes over that particular piece of land, then you've lost the entire population of that plant species. And that would be not good. Yeah. And then you're in trouble. A lot of trouble. Mm-hmm. Okay. Right. So how do these regulations affect our listeners or you? So exactly like what you said, you can be in trouble. So under the Endangered Species Act, it prohibits the take of a federally listed species. So basically what that means is it's illegal to harm or kill a listed species, whether it's on public land or private land. So a private citizen can actually be criminally charged or for killing or harming a species. So they do have civil as well as criminal penalties. So that's purposely or accidentally? Well, obviously, if you're driving down the road and you hit a deer, a listed deer, then you're not going to get, charged for it. But if you're going to shoot an endangered species of bird, yes, you will. I would surely hope that would not be the case, but I guess it happens, right? It does, yeah. Well, they should be caught and penalized. And some states also levy their own penalties. It just depends on which state you're in and what the project is. Okay. So let me. We're not quite there yet, but so let me ask you a question. So, in my neighborhood, they're building a road. Mm-hmm. Okay, they're taking it from 2 lanes to 4 lanes, and on that track of the road, they've taken out hundreds of trees. It actually sucks, it's. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so what you're saying is that someone like yourself went out there and they did a endangered species study, right, and to make sure that there's no beetles or birds or spotted owls or whatever that's on that endangered species. It depends on the project and what the impacts of the project are and what's actually found there, which will come to kind of like the methodology
We'll come to it in the next slide or so.
Okay. So, but how do you know? So, how do you know?
Right. So, if, let's say you have a property, the Fish and Wildlife Services actually maintains a database. You can actually go to the database and query by site. You can look for what is potentially listed within your search area. And many states do the same thing as well. They, like in Texas, we have the Texas Parks and Wildlife. You can actually query by county. And if you want more detailed information, you can actually request this in writing and ask about specific property based on your property boundaries. You can do that as well. And what they provide you is, what occurs within your study area. So it's not necessarily true that the particular species is on your property. They don't provide that kind of information because they don't really know if it actually occurs within the property boundary unless they have a record of that species actually occurring there, right? And so...
So wait a minute. Let me ask you a quick question. So, okay, so I have a property and I want to build something on it. I don't know exactly what I would build, but let's say I'm building something that would drastically change the landscape of the property. So I would need to I would start by hiring you or an ecologist to do an endangered species study. So, and what you guys would do is you would start with these two databases.
Right.
The federal and the state.
If it's in Texas, yes.
Yeah. So you go to your county and find out, okay, in this county, there are listed as, I think we talked about earlier about some kind of beetle.
A ground nesting beetle.
A what?
Ground nesting beetle.
A ground nesting beetle.
Sure.
Okay. So you go out there and, you literally just go look for beetles, or, so how does that
yeah,
work?
well, it depends. It depends on what, so let's kind of back up here a bit. So basically, this is what one would do. Basically, you look at the property and say, okay, what are the potential for this particular species or habitat to be present on that property? And then, so once you query that information, you get a list of species, you get information about the species, the habitat, its range, diet, life history, so on and so forth. And then you also get something called critical habitat information, and this is what the U.S. Fish and Wildlife provides.
What is that?
So the critical habitat is really the physical areas with the physical or biological features that are essential to a species conservation. So basically how they come up with something like this in layman terms is they look at the vegetation, they look at climate, they look at food resources, potential threats, so on and so forth. Something that is, basically they come up with a range for a species that it requires, basically habitat that it requires.
That is vital for their survival.
Exactly.
So yeah, layman's terms on these webinars, we call them Lance's terms.
So that's what a critical habitat is. And
Give me an example. Do you have an example of that?
Yeah, there's Houston toad here in Texas. There's critical habitat designated for that particular for that particular species. So again, it likes a certain kind of soil. There's food resources, certain forest types that it can be found in. So they map all that vegetation, the soils, and they say, okay, this is what the Houston toad requires to be here. Doesn't mean that it's found in all of those areas in the critical range, but that critical range area encompasses all that the Houston toad needs to survive.
Houston toads in Dallas?
No.
Okay, good. I'm just kidding. I'm just teasing. Okay, so migratory birds.
Right.
So that's interesting. So yeah.
In North America, we have 4 flyways that are broadly categorized. Flyways that migratory birds use to. It's based on their migratory patterns. So they'd migrate from Canada to Mexico and south of here, or whatever it is. And so they provide that information. So depending on where your project area is, you'll get a list of species that might be migrating through your project area during this. And then you'll get the time period in which they're migrating, the time period in which they might be nesting, so on and so forth. Okay,
so the Canadian goose, is that
You mean the Canada goose?
Well, I think it's called Canadian goose. I beg to differ. I think it's a Canadian goose because
it doesn't have a passport.
Well, all right. Well, we all know that there's Canadian bacon, so there you go. Okay. So is there other countries that have? Is a Canada goose? Is that endangered in Canada?
No, it's not endangered, but it is protected under the Migratory Birds Treaty Act. So
Okay.
it is a migratory bird, so it is protected under a separate act.
Okay.
Which we'll come to in a bit as
okay.
well.
Good. So,
going back to the process, once you have an understanding of what kind of species and habitat are present on your subject property, depending on the project and the location, there's a permitting and consultation process, and it depends on whether it's a federal project or a non-federal project. They have different processes for consultation. So basically, you consult with the Fish and Wildlife and the National Marine Fisheries Services. They provide recommendations on how to avoid impacts based on where your project is and what the property is. And if it's unavoidable impacts, let's say you want to build a road and you've done all your analysis and say, hey, this is the best area to put this road, but unfortunately, I'm going to be impacting this particular species, then you need permits. And along with those permits, you need a mitigation plan, which is really what the habitat conservation plan is. So it is quite extensive depending on the size of your project and the impacts of your project. This consultation process and the permitting process and the mitigation plan can be quite extensive.
So this really needs to be very early on. I mean, so
it needs to start from the beginning of the project.
I mean, from the beginning, because then if something is going to impact something that they don't know about, because that's why they're sending you out there anyway. So
exactly.
If they don't want to be midway and go, oh no, there's a, what do you call that beetle? A
ground nesting beetle.
A ground nesting beetle. Oh no, there's a ground nesting beetle, and then they're in trouble.
Right. Yeah.
Because then they're going to have to stop, obviously.
Yes, and it depends on, and there are different survey protocols and how you identify whether a species is actually likely to occur there or not. And,
okay.
And they provide guidelines as to what one can and cannot do.
Okay, so you do a lot of wetlands work.
Mm-hmm.
So how is that related to what you do with endangered species? So
that's a good question. So wetlands, what we call as waters of the U.S., are they're under a different authority. So they're protected under the Clean Water Act, Endangered Species under the Endangered Species Act. And they have different, they're administered by the Corps, the wetlands by the Corps of Engineers, and the endangered species by these agencies. So, but there is a link to them, right? So let's just say you have a property that has wetlands on it. It's waters of the U.S., and your project is going to impact the wetlands. As part of the permitting process, one is supposed to assess threatened and endangered species as part of the permitting process to the Corps of Engineers. Mm-hmm. And so the Corps of Engineers, depending on what your assessment is, will communicate with Fish and Wildlife Services, for example, to get their opinion as to how the project should proceed. So they're all linked in a way.
Okay, yeah, because you don't want to, I mean, then you'll be talking about, when we talk about critical habitats. I mean, that could impact critical habitats if you're... The
critical habitat or the species itself, yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So do we already do an example of this? So example of do you have an example of wetlands and impacting endangered species?
For sure. I'm currently working on a project where that's an issue. Actually, we're doing a permitting process, and there's potential habitat for a certain bird species on that property. So as part of our assessment and application to the Corps of Engineers, we have to put a strong package together. And that information, the Corps is going to share that information with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and there's going to be some recommendations that's going to be forwarded on to us.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go back to my road. Okay. Mm-hmm. So what happens when they're building a road, and it's February right now, and most of the bald eagles go to Cabo for the winter, right? So, or wherever they go, and so they're not going to be there now. So, that's going to be. So, how does that impact? Are we going to get to that, or how does that impact?
Right. The project.
Yeah. So, I mean, they're not there now, but they're going to be.
Right. Okay.
So
that's a really good question. So, so let's go to the next slide. So I was going to come to this anyway. So there are other than the Endangered Species Act, there are other relevant regulations and acts, and which I've listed a few here: wild bird conservation, marine mammal, migratory birds, bald Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Acts. So in the case, your example of the golden eagle, sorry, of the bald eagle, the bald eagle was removed from the endangered species list because it made a remarkable recovery. It was almost extinct, at the brink of extinction because of DDT and so on and so forth. But it made a remarkable recovery through combined efforts, and now it's off the endangered species list. However, it is still protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act as well as the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. So if you have a nesting bird, bald eagle, on your property, and there's a project that you're proposing, you still have to comply by the Migratory Bird and the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. Yeah. So and if your bald eagle is in Cabo, you still have to. There are protocols to follow before you actually take away their habitat. Right. Quotes. Right. So there are ways in which that. Actually, so you have to do a due diligence study. You have to figure out if there's habitat present. You have to figure out if there's a need for that bird to be there. Conservation plan, so on and so forth. Okay, so earlier we were talking about some kind of woodpecker. What woodpecker were we talking about earlier? I can't remember. Okay. Well, we were talking about this woodpecker, right? And so, like right now, you would go out and you would look for possibilities. Number one, it would be on that database, okay, that they're in that area or even in that county. Right. Okay. So you'd be looking for possible habitats for those woodpeckers? Like you would look for holes in trees and saying, that's a woodpecker hole. Yes, exactly. How would you know that? Well, there are certain protocols that you follow, and you have to be a biologist to actually recognize what you're doing. So yeah, it depends on your study and how far you want to go into the study and what the project is. So you figure out if this species occurs on if there's habitat. If there's habitat, do we need to do a bird survey? Do we need to do a cavity in the tree survey? Yes. So what we don't want is our Cabo-loving migrant birds to come home and we've tore down their house. Yes, exactly. So there, depending on the state as well, like there are some protection plans where you can't just mow down its habitat completely. Yeah. Yes. So if you do have something endangered on your property, it's kind of cool and fun, but there's some responsibility there. And there's also, they provide recommendations on when you can clear vegetation, so on and so forth, so that you're not impacting nesting birds and fledglings and so on. Okay. Okay, so proposed changes. So there's some changes going on. Right. So, I've given you sort of like an overview of the endangered species and how they're protected. And now, so the proposed changes, there's been a lot of talk about this, and these proposed changes came out I think in August of last year. And the changes are quite technical, in fact. So this has to do a lot with how they're proposing to treat a particular species. So one example is listing and delisting a species. So currently, the way they consider whether one needs to list a species or delist a species was based purely on like scientific knowledge on how is this particular bird species doing? Are there enough numbers of it? What's its range like? What are the potential threats? So on and so forth. So they collect all that data and say, okay, I think this deserves to be on the threatened list or the endangered species list. But now they're going to take into consideration economic consideration, right? Like they're going to be looking at the economics of actually putting that particular species, of protecting it, and say, is it economically feasible to do it? Does it make sense? Okay. Right. The second thing is, they have something called the foreseeable future. So when we talked about threatened species, threatened means a species that is likely to become endangered within the foreseeable future. So basically, when they're making a decision of whether to list this bird or not, they look at habitat loss, climate change, so on and so forth, to actually make that call. So they're looking forward to see how this species will do in the future. But so they're rethinking this whole concept of a foreseeable future, right? So, and one of the problems with that is that you can't, in this age of, of climate change and, what we're recognizing as being an important factor in threatening and endangering species, they're not going to be able to do that. They're not going to be able to take climate change, for instance, to build that into their models to see whether a species is going to be threatened or not. So like I said, this is quite technical, and there's a lot more things that goes into actually coming up with the list of species that they're identifying.
So do species come off the threatened species list? Like, you didn't quite make it, or you're doing better, or
yeah. I mean,
or sorry, you don't make enough money, so we're gonna economically. I'm just kidding. I'm kidding.
Yeah, you're not important. Sorry, you're not the polar bear.
So, but okay, so they come off, but okay.
Yeah.
Very good.
The other proposed change is how threatened species are being treated. So right now they're afforded the same protection as endangered species, but they're proposing to change that. So right now they use a blanket rule. Doesn't matter endangered or threatened. It's a blanket rule.
Yeah. So if it's, and that, I guess that would be a question, is that if it's a blanket rule, then why have the two? If you're protected the exact same, why have the two lists?
Because it's based on numbers and how well they're doing. Really, you know, you can, because.
I mean, I'm not arguing for things to be equally protected, but I mean, if they're going to be protected the same, why not just make them all endangered right then?
I think it's technicality based on
now that's
their
changing.
Range. Well, they want to change. It's not that they're going to rename threatened species something else or put it under a different category. They're just going to propose to change the level of protection that's afforded to them, and they're going to make this on a case-by-case basis. And then, but one of the concerns with this is that threatened species can actually be, kind of, pushed to and being on the endangered list faster if this were to happen. So that's one of the criticisms from people.
Okay.
If they're not afforded the same protection.
Okay.
Moving on, another proposed change is critical habitat. Now, we spoke about the critical habitat. Habitat is basically areas with physical or biological features that are essential to a species conservation, right? So in this example, this is just an animation where you have, let's just say this is the critical habitat of a bird species, let's just say. And those dots that you see there are occupied habitats. So we know those birds occupy those habitats. And this critical habitat.
And it's not the same bird, just living in different lists, right?
No.
We know that.
Well, even if it is, they have records of them actually living in that area.
Oh, there's Fred.
Flying from here to there.
Yeah, okay.
So, and the way, like we spoke about, like how the way in which they come up with this critical habitat. This particular polygon here represents the soils, the vegetation, the climatic conditions, the food resources that are essential to protect and for the vitality of this particular species, right? But you have unoccupied habitats here as well. So you can see a lot of the times when they come up with these maps is that the center of a species range is usually most heavily populated. That's just the way the modeling works. And so you can have these edges where you have really good habitat quality, but they're not occupied, but they're part of the critical habitat range because those are essential for the species to survive. So what they're proposing to do is they're going to evaluate areas that are occupied first. So for instance, I'll give you an example. So that green dot, let's just say you have a property there, right? That's your project property and you want to build something there. So when you consult with US Fish and Wildlife, they'll say, where are the occupied sites? So let's look at the occupied sites first. And if it's not occupied, then there's a different level of consultation. You may not need a permit, so on and so forth. Okay,
so even though your property is in the polygon, which is the first time I think we've ever used Polygon in our webinar. So congratulations, that's awesome. So I'm not going to be. It's not going to be as critical.
Yes, it's not going to be as critical because they're going to make.
Even though I'm in the polygon, but because there's not a little dot in that.
Exactly. So
now, if there was,
that would be a first priority.
Okay.
So they're going to look at that first, and then they're going to evaluate unoccupied habitats separately, and not as critical. All right. So other than delisting species and making it hard for projects and people to with permits and so on and so forth, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife actually does have a species recovery program, right? So they work towards enhancing a species existence. So basically the goal is to stop the decline of an endangered or threatened species by removing or reducing threats. And this is a collaborative effort. Collaborative effort. They partner with private landowners, with other federal agencies, state and local agencies. They come up with recovery plans. So they have an extensive list depending on what the species is and what one needs to do, the area, so on and so forth. And they also provide incentives to landowners. Landowners, for example, one example is the Safe Harbor program, where they can participate in recovery efforts, and then the permits that they might require in the future may not be as extensive, or it can be fast tracked, for instance.
And they could pay you for this?
You don't get paid for this. These are okay. Voluntary programs.
But you said,
right?
I thought you said earlier that they would sponsor that? Or?
Yeah, so that's the Partners of Fish and Wildlife program. So basically, they'll provide incentives, basic subsidies, or they'll pay for. Let's say you want to put bird boxes on your ranch or something like that. Participate in the recovery program. They'll pay for it, or they'll subsidize those initiatives.
So no rent money coming your way then. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I was watching this show on San Diego Zoo. And there was, they were saying in the streams of San Diego that there's particular type of frog that was, I don't know if it was endangered or it was endangered or was threatened, but they were worried about that particular frog that was, they were doing a recovery effort.
Right.
So this guy went out and went and found, they had some frogs and they released them into the wild. And then I don't know whether a couple years later, they went out into the field and they basically were searching for these frogs in the stream, catching them, taking pictures of them, giving them a quick exam, right. And then, of course, releasing them, which I thought it was fascinating. How would you know that's if they're recovering when the guy only found like 12 frogs?
Right. That's a really good question. So a recovery program is a long-term it includes long-term monitoring. So just because you release a bunch of animals back into the wild doesn't mean that they'll recover and actually establish a good population for them to be taken off the list, for instance. So this would, depending on the species, it's seasonal, yearly, multiple years, you have to monitor for numbers and habitat to make sure that they're actually thriving in the environment that they were released in.
Yeah.
So just on one sampling, there's no way of telling if this.
And how often do they do it? Do they do it every year or every month?
It depends on the species.
Okay.
And the life history, right?
Yeah.
So some species only live for a year. So some species live for 100 and odd years.
So next year the guy goes out and he only finds 8. I mean, is that he's like, oh no, or was he just not good at catching frogs that day? Well, again, that's based on
one sampling.
Right.
Right. So that's it needs to have a good.
That's interesting.
Good sample data. Like it needs to have like multiple years, multiple data sets in order to establish a good sample set to understand if that species is doing well. So one of the success stories, at least here in Texas, is the black-capped vireo was removed from the endangered species list last year, and Fish and Wildlife Services had a recovery plan, and a large part of the success was due to landowner participation, right? So they had a plan. They sort of provided guidance to landowners as to what to do and how to partner with them, and landowners in Texas and Oklahoma worked towards this, and it was taken off the list last year. Yay. And it benefits everybody to take a species off a list, right? Because it's not endangered anymore. So if you have black-capped vireo on your property or habitat on your property, then you don't have to go through this extensive studies. You don't have to go through mitigation, and you're potentially saving a lot of money.
So this was a case that. Why do you know why this particular bird was put on? I mean, obviously it was, but do you know why it was?
Yeah, I think it was predation from other birds like cowbirds, cow-headed birds. So and habitat loss and so on and so forth. Yeah, so that's why I think it was put on the endangered species list in 1987, I believe.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And it just got off.
Brown-headed cowbirds. Sorry.
Wow. That's pretty cool. So Are there? So those are in Texas. So those are.
They are in Texas.
So So this is probably a silly question, but if it's on the National Endangered Species List, automatically it's going to be on the state. But just because it's on the state, because we've established the state has their own list,
it's not necessarily
on the okay. So
federal list, yeah.
Is there? Because
technically that's how it's supposed to be.
They could be endangered. Like we were talking about the Alaskan otter, or is it Alaska otter?
Well, yeah. Well.
anyway,
let's just call it the sea otter.
The sea otter. Okay.
That's
in Alaska, it's endangered.
Right.
But in California, they're going. We got plenty of them.
Yeah, that could be the case. That could be the case. Yeah.
Okay. And so, all right.
But I think it's also endangered in California. I don't have to check that. It depends on the species, really. But
if you haven't seen the video of a baby otter, you're missing it.
So cute.
It is, and I think at the
I've seen real otter, like baby otters, sitting
I think
on
at the Dallas Zoo.
Stomach.
I think at the Dallas or the Fort Worth Zoo. I think you can actually pay to have like 30 minutes to play with the baby otter, and that might be worth every penny.
Yeah.
So, but you can't take pictures. I'm just kidding. I don't know that. Okay, so that's enough of the birds. There we go.
Last but not least, Lance, if you were ever thinking of bringing back a baby black rhino from Africa, don't. Because they are protected internationally. The Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Flora and Fauna are administered by the Fish and Wildlife Services here in the U.S., so you can be criminally charged.
Well, I would hope so, because that would be horrible. And who would want to?
People do. They bring back exotic flowers and stuff like that, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's trade in endangered species.
I guess if you're bringing in over like an endangered poison ivy, you need to make sure that you put it on your carry-on.
Well,
don't put it.
Yeah. Well,
don't
the problem
conceal
with
in
something
other
like
ways.
that is it can be an invasive species, and then you'll be decimating populations here.
Yeah. So okay. So for all our listeners who are thinking about bringing over a baby rhino, that's a no-no. So okay. So are there endangered species throughout the world?
Yes.
That. So is that so that would be an automatic?
Yes.
They're on our endangered species list.
Well.
I mean, because the black rhino, that's endangered species.
You have to remember
correct?
that there's technicalities here too, right? It's trade
the snow leopard.
Yeah, a trade in endangered species. So you can't, without a permit, you can't. It has to be sustainable. I think they call it sustainable trading. So you can't bring a black rhino for it to be sustainable. What are you going to do with the black rhino bringing it here? But also remember that tigers are, like the Bengal tiger is also on the endangered species list, international. But people have tigers here in Texas. So there's
But not natural, or is that not?
They're not. Yeah, they don't pick them up from the wild and bring them
They're
here.
not natural.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
so. They're bred. Yeah.
Yeah, or you get them from circus animals.
Circus
animals. Hey, that's a thing. They have a whole thing in Tyler, I think, that has exotic.
They have animals.
Exotic cat zoo. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that they've rescued from circuses. Is that what it is? Oh, yeah. Okay, that's nice.
What do you think it was?
I thought it was a circus with exotic animals. I'm like,
no,
that's
actually,
so sad.
no. I think they stopped doing that. Actually, I don't think the circus has any circus animals anymore.
That's good.
Yeah, we can all agree on that. So.
All right.
Okay, we're done.
Well, thank you.
All right. Well, here's Anjali's contact information. If you need to ask her a question about the brown beetle, or whatever it was.
Ground nesting beetle.
Ground nesting beetle. Or you want to look for, you want to get, pricing on a black rhino, she would be at least the person to talk you out of it. So there's her contact information. So we're going to, you know what? We have one more slide before this. I don't know what happened to it, but questions. Is there any questions that we have, Lydia, that anybody came up with? No questions? I see one just came up. So, okay. So how often do endangered species come off the list?
That's a good question. Not very often, I must say. I don't know at the rate at which they come down. But there have been a few success stories, like the bald eagle, Florida manatee, gray wolf. These charismatic species usually come off the list. Yeah.
Okay, so we did talk about, somebody asked that you can be criminally charged for killing a species.
Yes, you can be. Yeah, civil and criminal penalties. Yeah.
Threatened and endangered, or
both?
Okay.
Both.
Well, now is that going to change because if it's a threatened, maybe not, or is that still the deal?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know how, in terms of like the legalities of it. I'm not sure.
Okay. And then, so we did talk about, and there's one question about relocation. Can you relocate if you're in a project? Can you relocate a species from one location to another?
Yes, you can.
Okay.
Yeah, but you need permits and a proper plan to go with that permit. Yeah, if it's endangered, yes, you can do that.
Okay.
To save it. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think that's all the questions that we had. Lydia's nodding her head, and hey, applause to Lydia. She ran her first webinar, so that's way to go, Lydia. So our next webinar is next month on TRI and pollution prevention reporting. This was one webinar we usually did in January, but it was so packed we decided to space them out. So Lori Siegelman and Victor Kaysen will be hosting that webinar in March. So if you haven't signed up for there. And Anjali, thank you very much for very informative. Very, this is kind of a cool subject because who doesn't
love bugs and bunnies?
Yeah,
right?
You know what I mean. So very interesting. So thank you very much, and I'll get you on the schedule for next year. So you have a year to prepare. So thank you guys very much for joining us. Again, we'll be getting the recordings and the slides out on our website, and I will email you all the link. Have a great day.
Thank you.